Hello and welcome to Nexus Extra. This week we've been looking at Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages, and we've been looking at the US Department of Energy's conclusion that most likely the virus did leak out of a laboratory in Wuhan, although they do say that with low confidence. We're going to talk about all of these issues further now with Isabel Hilton, a journalist, founder of China Dialogue, and visiting professor at King's College. Thanks so much for joining us, Isabel. Let's start with Matt Hancock. Which of these messages exposed in the Daily Telegraph did you find most alarming, most revealing, and most egregious?
That could be quite a long list, honestly.
Well, there's only
I mean, I
2.3
think
million
that the
words
most
and 100,000 messages, but yes,
uh,
no, I agree with you.
dear, oh dear. And I think that actually the more disturbing, although perhaps not surprising, impression that you get from reading these things is that at the time, of course, the government was very insistent that it was following the science, that every step it took was kind of science-based. Actually, when you see what they were talking about and the decisions that were making as revealed in these WhatsApp messages, they were constantly thinking of how it would play, or what the voters would think, and not really following the science as closely as they had us believe.
In particular, I noticed that Matt Hancock was concerned about hitting his 100,000 vaccinations a day target, perhaps more than he should have been, and perhaps to the detriment of people living in care homes.
Well, that's a very good example. And the advice was that you didn't, that you should prioritize vaccinations, that those who need it most. We had a terrible death rate in care homes. They were discharging people from hospitals and putting them back into care homes, which was terrible. And the medical advice was that you perhaps don't need to vaccinate everybody, and let's look at who we really do need to vaccinate and who we need to vaccinate first. So again, there were consequences to these decisions, and it is extremely revealing to see exactly how they were thinking about them.
People who are firmly against the lockdowns point out in particular that Hancock talked about scaring the pants off people and deploying the new variant, the Kent variant. Now, they will seize on that to say that, of course, there was a secret government narrative and they wanted to take control of our lives and so on and so on. From your perspective, was the language just callous and careless, or does it reveal something more?
I honestly don't. I tend not to embrace secret conspiracy theories. They're all too easy. They've been around forever. Um, you know, and no, I think the language is the language. It's laddish language. It doesn't surprise me. If you listen to Parliament, if you listen to the way people behave around Parliament, it's absolutely in character. I don't think, and it's also in character of a politician who's thinking about how his every move plays with the voters.
Rather
This
boorish.
doesn't speak conspiracy.
If the same pandemic had hit Britain, say, 30 years ago, under, say, Margaret Thatcher or perhaps even Tony Blair, do you think, of course, they didn't have WhatsApp in those days, but do you think the language, they would have been more careful, more dignified, or was politics always thus?
Politics was always a rough trade, but I think what is different now is that we have a means of capturing, just how rough it is. Whereas in Margaret Thatcher's day or Tony Blair's day, you might have had these conversations, or they might have been phone calls, of which notes may or may not have been taken. So what is revealing about this is the actually raw, unfiltered nature of these communications. I think they probably were often or always like that, but we just didn't know it.
I completely skipped over the John Major period, which is unfortunate, but I think a lot of people do.
I'm sure we were all terribly polite in the John Major period.
Very much so, very much so. Can we turn to the US Energy Department now, which has concluded that the COVID pandemic most likely arose from a laboratory leak? And although it stated that with, in inverted commas, low confidence, what does that tell you? Does it change your view about, say, for example, China's culpability in this?
Not really. I mean, this is a discussion that's been going on since COVID first emerged, and certainly since the WHO's first visit, the only one in which there was substantial collaboration with the Chinese authorities. And, I'm not a virologist, but I have read arguments on both sides. And on the whole, it seems to me the balance of opinion still favors a natural origin theory, though they haven't found the intermediate host definitively. The problem now is that the whole issue is so politicized, we may never get to the bottom of it.
Mm. And it's not just because it's politicized, but because of the opacity of the Communist Party's decision-making.
That's true. I mean, the arc of COVID in China, it began very, very badly in the sense that the first people who were whistleblowing were ignored or then punished, and in one very famous case, died of COVID. So it began badly, and they were very slow to react in Wuhan. The central government came in and essentially locked China down for the following 2 years and then claimed victory. But in the course of that, in January 2021, the WHO international team went to China, worked very closely actually with Chinese scientists, and were looking at both the market, which is near the lab, which is part of the reason there's a lot of confusion, and concluded that although it was possible that a lab leak had occurred, it was less likely than a natural origin. At that point, however, when they released their report, the Chinese authorities were so incensed that the lab leak be mentioned at all that they then pretty much shut down all further cooperation. And the problem with that is that if you're not open and transparent, if you're not cooperating, then everybody assumes that you have something to hide. And that just feeds the lab leak theory, and particularly coming from sections of American opinion, which are also very hostile to Anthony Fauci, who was working with the Wuhan lab on some gain-of-function experiments. So it's a perfect storm for those who were hostile to Fauci, who were hostile to China, and were hostile to the whole idea of the pandemic.
Isabel, one last question, just going back to the Matt Hancock story. It's a question of journalism. You've been a journalist for a long time. Another Isabel Oakeshott, was working with Matt Hancock to produce his memoirs, The Pandemic Diaries, and she was given 100,000 plus WhatsApp messages, which she subsequently gave to the Telegraph. Just on a matter of ethics, she defends herself by saying it's in the public interest. Are you convinced by that?
Well, I think what she did was unethical, to be frank. I mean, somebody described this dispute as watching a snake eat a rat. It's really hard to decide who you're sympathetic to in this situation. But the fact is that she did sign a non-disclosure agreement. And there is a journalistic principle of protecting your source. Among other things, I chair the Center for Investigative Journalism, and source protection is one of the things that we teach there because it's extremely important. You may not consider Matt Hancock a source worthy of protection, since he's notoriously a self-publicist too. But the fact is that even in cases such as Matt Hancock's, there is an obligation, particularly if you've given your word, to honor that word. And if we allow this to be passed as an ethical bit of behavior, then others who are much more vulnerable become, it's more dangerous for any source after that.
Of course, Oakeshott says she received the WhatsApp messages after she signed the confidentiality agreement. The confidentiality agreement is somewhat different to an NDA. I don't know, and we don't have time to explore it. Unfortunately, Isabel Hilton, thank you so much for your time today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Nexus Extra.